It's a real pleasure to be here in Parliament today for the launch of the Freedom in the Arts new report, the new Boycott Crisis, and the accompanying Art Beyond Boycott Toolkit as well. Now, some of you are more familiar with this than others, but by the end of the evening, you'll all be intimately familiar. And as I said, thank you all for being here today, and thank you in particular to Rosie Kay, to Denise Fahmy, and Professor Joe Phoenix, authors of the new Boycott Crisis. Now, this report is an important and very timely contribution to the debate that has too often been conducted in fragments. What we mean by that is through noisy rows and media headlines. And this report brings evidence and structure, something many people in the sector have felt that has been missing for some time. Because this is the reality. We've got pressure, we've got fear, and we've got organised intimidation. And that is beginning to shape the conditions in which art is made, and that is not good. And sadly, this is not simply a matter of a few isolated controversies. This is getting to the point where it's pervasive. And this report highlights what the authors call boycott logic. It's created where there's an interconnected pattern of pressure, reshaping what artists, venues and organisations feel able to create, present and discuss. And that should concern us all. The arts are not some optional extra in national life. The arts are where a society imagines, questions, remembers and argues with itself. It's where freedom of thought becomes a living and public experience. Freedom of expression is not peripheral to democracy. It is part of its texture and one of its tests. And in any healthy democracy, the arts should be places of experimentation, of disagreement, curiosity and risk. They should not become places where people are forced into silence by fear, reputational intimidation or organised campaigns. And yet that is precisely the concern the new boycott crisis raises. Now, the report describes a climate in which many artists, and particularly freelancers, dependent on reputation and networks of goodwill, they are finding opportunities disappearing, not because of the quality of their work, but because of who they are, what they are assumed to believe, or the controversies others fear may follow. Venues and festivals are increasingly making decisions not in response to actual protest, but in anticipation of what might happen, often under internal staff pressure rather than audience demand. This is the notion of anticipatory compliance that's highlighted in the report, where the damage is often done before any public campaign even gets going, and where the possibility of backlash becomes enough to shape decisions. And each act of compliance makes the next one even easier. And that matters not only for the arts, but for public life more broadly. When freedom of expression in the arts is narrowed by fear, intimidation, or organised pressure, that is not only a cultural concern, it's a democratic one. The arts should challenge and question and push boundaries. Of course they should. But there is a world of difference between pushing boundaries, having a respectful and informed, robust debate, and intimidation or cancellation, or worse, promulgating hatred. Pushing extreme views and cancelling out others is not normal. It is extremist behaviour, and it is inconsistent with core British values, and I would say this as a conservative, inconsistent with conservative values of freedom, democracy, tolerance, genuine inclusivity, responsibility and respect for each other and for law and order. But it never ceases to amaze me how so many people who go around lecturing everybody else about diversity and preaching tolerance lack the self-awareness to recognise that they themselves are often the worst offenders and amongst the least tolerant kind of people around. Because they don't actually believe in freedom and tolerance, they cannot accept anyone with a different view from their own. And what they really want is everyone else to think just like them. And if you don't, you are somehow malevolent. And that brings me to one of the most serious findings of the new Boycott Crisis report. The report is clear that antisemitism is not incidental. It's one of the most troubling features of this boycott logic. The evidence gathered suggests that Jewish and Israeli artists are disproportionately affected by organised pressure, and that Jewish artists are too often subjected to exceptional scrutiny, exclusion or suspicion. Jewish artists and Jewish cultural life become treated uniquely contentiously, uniquely risky or somehow inherently political. That should trouble all of us. Where Jewish cultural life is treated as inherently problematic, or where Jewish identity itself becomes a trigger for pressure and distrust, that should concern anyone who values fairness, democracy, and the integrity of our public culture. And of course, this is not about endorsing every work or every point of view. None of us agree with everything or every piece of art or expression performed by people in the room here this evening. But it is about whether our arts sector remains a place where disagreement can exist without coercion and intimidation, and where institutions have the confidence to act lawfully, proportionately, and fairly. And that is why the second part of tonight's launch matters just as much as the first, because alongside the report, Freedom in the Arts is also launching the Art Beyond Boycott Toolkit. And this is a practical response to boycott pressure. It provides clear guidance, step-by-step tools, templates, and checklists. It recognises both lawful protest and artistic independence. It's not just diagnosing a problem, it's actually helping the sector respond to it. And government and politicians have a role here too. And I should say, talking of which, we'll be voting in a couple of minutes, so I'll finish my speak and then head off, but you might see some MPs disappear in the meantime. As I said, democratic institutions should not be indifferent when fear begins to shape public culture. Parliament is exactly the right place to have this debate. The concerns raised by this report deserve serious engagement from ministers, officials, politicians, and all those responsible for the health of our cultural institutions, and especially those that are publicly funded or lottery funded. The debate is timely. We Conservatives are conducting our own policy review, and this report will input into that. We're considering the role, the purpose, the remit and distribution criteria for lottery funding bodies. And we are, of course, in a live debate about the funding and scope of the BBC and how it abides by its impartiality obligations. And if you'll allow me to go off on a slight tangent here, may I remind you that the BBC's own editorial guidelines clearly state that audiences expect the BBC to meet the highest levels of impartiality and accuracy. Well, I couldn't agree more. The guidelines also make clear that there is no requirement to give all views equal weight. Minority views, or those less supported by evidence, do not need to be given similar prominence or weight to those with more support, to the prevailing consensus, or to those better evidence, which begs the very serious question why the BBC cannot bring itself to call Hamas a terrorist organisation, for example, or why it felt obliged to reprimand a journalist, Martin Croxall, for saying women instead of pregnant people live on air. Impartiality should not be used as an excuse to push minority opinions not supported by the majority of the British population. And moreover, in this particular case, I believe that the breach of impartiality rules by the BBC was not by Martin Croxall's unscripted comment, but the editor or writer who put the words pregnant people in her script in the first place. This is a misinterpretation of the guidelines. And before I finish, I'd like to highlight that we have many remarkable people in the room with us this evening, each bringing a different perspective on the problem. Rosie Kay, as co-director of Freedom in the Arts and one of the authors of the report, will introduce the other speakers and guide us through this evening in a moment. And I hope all of you will take the opportunity this evening to introduce yourselves and continue the conversations with our guests this evening. Tonight is important for many reasons, because we are discussing real-life experiences, evidence and principles. Most of all, it's recognising that artistic freedom is not a luxury. It's one of the conditions of a confident and truly free society. So I'd like, again, to thank Freedom in the Arts for the work they have done in bringing this report and the toolkit forward, and for the support they have already provided so many artists and organisations under extreme pressure. This is work of real public value. And it now gives me great pleasure to invite Rosie, co-director of Freedom in the Arts and co-author of the report, to speak about the work that she has brought towards us this evening. But forgive me if I don't hear the whole thing, because I'd better vote. But I'll be back very shortly. Thank you very much.